Mafia boss kidnapped a college girl, then discovered she was pregnant with his baby. He didn't knock. He didn't call. He simply sent 4 men in black raincoats to collect her like she was something he'd misplaced. Imani Brooks was 24 years old, standing on a Seoul sidewalk with rain soaking through her jacket, when the car stopped and the doors opened and the world she had spent 6 years building was ripped out from under her. No screaming, no warning, just hands, professional, efficient, emotionless, and then darkness. She woke up above the city, glass everywhere, the Han River 30 floors below her feet, glittering like it had no idea what was happening in the room above it. And a man sitting across from her, watching her the way people watch things they've already decided to own. If that were you, if you opened your eyes and realized freedom was 30 floors down, what would you do? Stay with us. Subscribe to the channel and follow this story all the way to its end, because what happens next inside that penthouse will shake you. Hit like, drop a comment with the city and country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go back to the beginning. The rain had been falling since afternoon, the kind of Seoul rain that doesn't come with thunder or drama. It just arrives and stays, soaking everything slowly until the city smells like wet concrete and exhaust, and something older underneath both. Imani walked with her bag pulled tight against her side, earbuds in, half listening to a lecture recording she'd already heard twice and still hadn't fully absorbed. She was tired. That was the honest truth. Not the poetic kind of tired that sounds interesting when you describe it. Just the ordinary exhausted of a graduate student who'd spent the last 11 days reading secondary scholarship on post-colonial literature and eating convenience store ramen at 11 at night because cooking felt like one task too many. Her advisor had returned her latest chapter draft with 19 comments, most of them legitimate, several of them brutal. She had a funding application due in 3 weeks. Her right shoulder ached from carrying her laptop bag at a bad angle for months. She was thinking about all of this. The chapter, the funding, whether she had any of that ginger tea left in the cabinet, when the black sedan rolled up beside her and stopped. She almost didn't register it. Expensive cars weren't unusual near this part of the neighborhood. She kept walking. The second car cut in front of her. She stopped. Pulled out one earbud. The rear door of the first sedan opened. Later, she would replay this moment hundreds of times and try to identify the exact second she understood something was wrong. The answer was always the same. She understood when the first man stepped out, and she saw that his eyes weren't looking at her with curiosity or aggression or any of the usual calculations men made when they stopped a woman on the street. He was looking at her the way you look at a task, something to complete, something already decided. She turned to run. The second man was already there. The third appeared from an alley she'd walked past 100 times without once considering it as a problem. She fought. That part mattered to her afterward, though it didn't change anything. She threw an elbow that connected with someone's jaw, hard enough that she felt the impact up her arm. She tried to scream and got a hand across her mouth. Not violent, just firm. And then something pressed against her neck and the sidewalk tilted and went dark. The last thing she saw was the rain, still falling, indifferent to everything. She came back to consciousness in pieces. The sensation of fabric against her cheek, expensive, smooth, the kind of material that cost more than her monthly stipend. The smell of cedar and something floral, not aggressive, just present. The sound of a city far below, muffled through glass thick enough to swallow it almost entirely. She kept her eyes closed for 30 seconds. She was cataloging. She had grown up around her father's world long enough to know that information gathered before you reveal you're awake is worth more than anything you can learn after. She counted breathing. 2 people in the room, one close, one near the far wall. She tested her wrists and ankles carefully. No restraints. She was lying on a couch, not bound to a chair. That was either good or designed to look good. With men like these, it was usually the second thing. She opened her eyes. The room was extraordinary. She hated that that was her first coherent thought. She'd wanted her first thought to be tactical, useful, something her situation deserved. Instead, she clocked the floor-to-ceiling windows, the Han River spread out below like a painting that had no idea. It was also a prison, the bookshelves, actual bookshelves, floor-to-ceiling on one wall, stuffed with real books, not decorative ones, and the light, which was low and amber and designed to make a person feel safe, which was itself a kind of threat. The man sitting across from her didn't look up immediately. He was reading something. A document, not a phone. He held a glass of whiskey with 2 fingers, tilted slightly, and he turned a page without hurry. He was 30-something, Korean, dressed in a charcoal suit jacket over a plain dark shirt with no tie, and he had the particular stillness of someone who had spent years deciding that urgency was beneath him. He let her look at him for a full 10 seconds before he spoke. "You're awake," he said. His English was good, almost unaccented with a flatness to certain vowels that suggested he'd learned it somewhere specific, not from television. "There's water on the table beside you." Imani sat up slowly, looked at the water, looked at him. "My name, I know your name," he said, turning another page. "Imani Brooks, 24. PhD candidate in comparative literature, Yonsei University. Your undergraduate thesis was on Toni Morrison's use of haunt and spatial memory. Your current dissertation focuses on diasporic identity in contemporary African and African American fiction." He finally looked up. "You've been in Seoul for 2 years and 3 months. You haven't spoken to your father in 6. The silence that followed had weight. Imani said, "And you're the man who had me kidnapped." "I'm the man who had you brought here, yes?" He said it without flinching. "That's the same thing." "Semantically, yes." He set the document aside. "My name is Seo Tae-jun." "I don't care what your name is." She looked at the windows. 30 floors down. The rain was still falling. "I want to know what you want and when I'm going home." Tae-jun considered this. He picked up his glass, took a slow sip, set it back on the table. Everything he did had that quality. Considered, unhurried, as if the world around him was simply waiting for his decisions rather than happening regardless. "Your father," he said, "ordered the murder of my younger brother 5 years ago. His name was Seo Min-jae. He was 29. He paused. "Did Malcolm ever mention him?" Imani's jaw tightened. "I haven't spoken to my father in 6 years. You just said that yourself." "I know, but I wondered if the name had come up before you stopped speaking." "It didn't." Tae-jun nodded slowly, as if this was an answer he'd already anticipated. Min-jae was trying to leave the organization. He had a plan, legitimate business, legal structures, a future that didn't require us to become what we'd spent our entire lives becoming. Your father decided that Min-jae's exit created a problem. A man who leaves carries information, and Malcolm Brooks does not tolerate problems he can solve cheaply. He said it without raising his voice, without any performance of grief, which was somehow worse than performance would have been. Imani said, "I'm sorry about your brother." "I know you are." Tae-jun tilted his head slightly. "That's why you're here rather than somewhere less comfortable. Comfortable doesn't make it a choice." He almost smiled. "No, it doesn't." She stood up then. Not because she had anywhere to go. The room was beautiful and completely sealed, and she'd already marked the elevator, the single interior door, and the 2 men positioned at the edges of the space pretending not to watch her. She stood because she refused to be talked down to from a couch. "So you took me to hurt him," she said. "That's your brilliant plan." "He loves you," Tae-jun said simply. "He hides it, probably even from himself, because love in Malcolm Brooks's world is a liability. But intelligence I've gathered over 5 years is clear on this point. You are the one person he would trade his empire to protect. He drove my mother into the ground and watched. That's different." "Is it?" Tae-jun looked at her for a long moment. Something moved in his face. Not softness exactly, but a kind of recognition she hadn't expected. Your mother was part of his world. In his logic, she understood the risks when she chose to stay. You left. He paused. In Malcolm Brooks's logic, that makes you innocent. He separates things into categories, and you fell into the wrong one. "The wrong one," Imani said. "The one that matters to him." She picked up the glass of water, looked at it, set it back down. "So you keep me here until he does what? Falls apart? Comes for me himself so you can... What exactly? Kill him?" "I haven't decided all of that yet." "You haven't decided?" The disbelief in her voice was genuine. "You had me taken off a sidewalk in the rain, and you haven't decided the rest of the plan." "The goal is clear," Tae-jun said. "The execution is still in progress." She looked at him for a long time. Then she reached across the table, picked up his whiskey glass, and threw it directly into his face. The room reacted immediately. The 2 men near the walls moved. Tae-jun raised one hand and they stopped. He sat completely still. The whiskey ran down his face and the front of his jacket. A piece of ice sat on his shoulder. He didn't reach for a cloth. He didn't wipe his face. He simply looked at her with an expression that was not anger. She'd been prepared for anger, but something closer to interest. Like a problem had just become more complicated in a way he found genuinely engaging. "Feel better?" he asked. "No," she said honestly. He almost smiled again. This time it reached further. "Good." He stood, reached into his breast pocket for a folded cloth, and wiped his face methodically. He was calm the whole way through it. That composure frightened her more than rage would have. Rage she knew. Rage had patterns. Whatever this man's version of control was, she hadn't found its edges yet. "You'll have everything you need here," he said. "Books, food, medical attention if necessary, communication with anyone outside this building who is not your father or connected to him. You won't be harmed." He buttoned his jacket over the whiskey stain. "I give you my word on that." "Your word?" Imani said. "I understand that means very little to you right now." "It means exactly nothing." He nodded. "Then let it mean nothing, and still know it." He moved toward the elevator. One of the men stepped aside for him. "The housekeeper's name is Park Mi-suk. She'll show you to your room. The library is yours. The kitchen is fully stocked. The windows," he paused without turning around, "are bulletproof and they do not open. I won't insult you by pretending otherwise." The elevator opened. He stepped inside. Imani said, "You know this makes you exactly like him." He stopped, didn't turn. "You want to punish a man for violence," she said. "So you commit violence against someone who had nothing to do with it. I didn't order anyone killed. I've never held a weapon in my life. I got on a plane when I was 18 and I built something completely separate. And you grabbed me off a sidewalk anyway." She let the words sit. "Your brother wanted something different, and you made yourself into the thing that killed him." The silence lasted several seconds. Tae-jun said, very quietly, "You should eat something." The elevator doors closed. Imani stood in the middle of the most beautiful room she'd ever been in and hated everything about it with such precision that she had to press both hands flat against her thighs and breathe through it. She wasn't going to cry. Crying was information she wasn't prepared to give anyone in this building tonight. She crossed to the bookshelves. Her hands were shaking, and she used the motion of scanning titles as something to focus on. Walcott, Adichie, Achebe, Komunyaka, Baldwin, Naipaul. The books were in order by author, not genre or language. Someone had actually thought about it. Someone had cared enough about the selection to think. That scared her almost as much as the windows. She pulled out a Baldwin and held it, not reading it, just holding the familiar weight. She was a prisoner. She was a prisoner in a place where someone had already put exactly the books she would reach for, and she didn't yet know if that was cruelty or something worse. She was going to need to think clearly. She was going to need to map this building, understand these people, find every crack in every routine before she tried anything. She was going to need to be patient in a way that didn't feel like surrender. And underneath all of it, running below the fear and the calculation and the steady controlled anger, was something she couldn't afford to examine yet. She hadn't eaten in hours. She was exhausted and terrified and furious. And for the first time since her mother's hands had stopped shaking at that kitchen table in Baltimore when Imani was 16 years old, watching a woman she loved being slowly consumed by a world Imani refused to inherit. For the first time since that moment, she felt the particular loneliness of being inside something with no visible exit and no one coming who knew how to find her. She pressed her back against the bookshelves. She breathed. She didn't let herself cry. Not tonight. Tonight she was going to eat and sleep, and when morning came through those bulletproof windows over the Han River, she was going to start figuring out how to burn this whole careful plan to the ground from the inside. She slept badly and woke up knowing exactly where she was. That was the thing nobody told you about captivity. The first morning was the worst, not because of fear, but because of the 3 seconds right after consciousness returned where everything still felt normal. 3 seconds of nothing. Then the Han River appeared through the glass, 30 floors down, slate gray in the early light, and the previous night came back in full. Imani lay still for another minute, counted her breathing, took inventory the way she used to as a kid in Baltimore when she heard things downstairs that she wasn't supposed to hear. Voices, movement, the particular silence that meant someone was trying not to be heard. She'd learned early that the body wants to panic, and the mind has to decide whether to let it. She didn't let it. She got up, washed her face with cold water, looked at herself in the bathroom mirror for a long time. She had a bruise along her left jaw where someone's shoulder had connected during the struggle on the sidewalk. It wasn't bad. She'd had worse from being careless with a cabinet door. She pressed 2 fingers against it, felt the ache, and decided the ache was useful. It kept her from making the mistake of pretending she was somewhere she wasn't. She dressed in the clothes that had been left in the room. They fit, which meant someone had known her size before last night, and that meant planning that went back weeks at minimum. She filed that away. Park Mi-suk was already in the main room when Imani came out. The housekeeper was a woman in her mid-50s with short hair and quick eyes that didn't miss anything but weren't unkind. She moved around the kitchen space with the efficiency of someone who had spent years making large amounts of competence look small. She set a plate on the counter without being asked, rice, eggs, some kind of braised vegetable, and poured tea without making it into a moment. "Thank you," Imani said, because her mother had raised her with manners regardless of circumstance. Mi-suk nodded once, said nothing, went back to whatever she'd been doing. Imani ate standing at the counter and watched the room. 3 men on rotation near the elevator. The interior door she'd marked last night was a service corridor. She'd heard footsteps through it at intervals, regular enough to be scheduled. The elevator required a key card that lived in a breast pocket or a small clip near the hip, depending on the guard. The windows were what Tae-jun had said, bulletproof, sealed, no mechanism for opening visible from the inside. 42 stories of Seoul below the sill, and nothing between here and there except glass that cost more than her entire education. She ate the eggs. They were good. That irritated her. Tae-jun did not appear that morning, or the afternoon. She spent the day with the Baldwin she'd taken from the shelf the night before, reading the same paragraph 4 times before giving up and switching to actually useful activity. Walking the perimeter of the penthouse level, counting steps, noting load-bearing positions, watching the guards change shifts at 2-hour intervals. She noted which of them made eye contact and which of them had been specifically instructed not to. She noted where the cameras were mounted and where the angles created blind spots no larger than a doorway width. She stored all of it. He appeared at 6 in the evening carrying a takeout bag from somewhere that smelled like pork bone broth, set it on the table in the main room as if they'd agreed to dinner, and sat down like a man who had every right to be in the room, which technically and in every functional sense he did. Imani looked up from the couch. "I didn't agree to this. You haven't eaten since this morning," he said, opening containers with the same measured movements he applied to everything. "You're having me watched." Mi-suk mentioned it. "Same thing." He paused, looked at her. "You're going to be here for some time. Refusing meals won't accomplish anything except making you weaker, and I don't think weakness is something you're interested in." She hated that he was right. She got up and sat across from him at the table. They ate for a while without speaking. The broth was extraordinary, and she refused to say so. Tae-jun ate without looking at his phone, without reading, without any of the props people usually deployed to avoid the discomfort of silence. He seemed comfortable in it in a way that suggested he'd chosen it deliberately for most of his life. "What happened to her?" Imani said finally. "Your brother's wife. His family." Tae-jun's spoon paused for 1/2 second. "He wasn't married. He had a woman he was going to ask. Her name was Yuna. She left Seoul 8 months after he died. I don't know where she is." "You didn't try to find her. She wanted to be gone. I respected that." Imani looked at him across the steam rising from her bowl. "But you don't respect when someone else wants to be gone." He met her eyes. "No, not in this case. Because I'm useful. Because your father needs to feel what losing someone feels like when there's absolutely nothing you can do about it." He said it flatly. "No drama. He took something from me and continued existing as if it cost him nothing. I intend to change his understanding of cost. And after, once he's suffered enough by your measurement, what happens to me then? You go home. Just like that. Just like that." Imani put her spoon down. "You actually believe that. You've told yourself a story where you're the man who kidnaps a woman, holds her until her father breaks, and then sends her home unharmed, and that's justice. That's fair. I haven't called it either of those things. What do you call it?" He was quiet for a moment. "Necessary." She pushed back from the table. Not leaving, there was nowhere to go. just creating distance. My mother used that word. Every time she explained something my father had done that she couldn't actually explain. It was necessary. The people who got hurt, the things that were broken, the years she spent being slowly swallowed by a man who needed her, scared, all necessary. You know what that word really means? Tae-jun didn't answer. It means you've already decided the outcome matters more than the people inside it. He looked at her for a long time. Something in his face was working on something. She could see it moving, whatever it was, beneath the composure. Then he stood, cleared his own bowl, and set it in the kitchen. The library has a reading lamp that adjusts, he said. Maisuk mentioned you were in the low light last night. The control is on the base. He left. Imani sat at the table alone with the Han River going dark behind the glass, and a feeling she couldn't name sitting somewhere behind her sternum. Something between fury and the unsettling recognition that the man she was supposed to hate without complication was not, in fact, uncomplicated. That was a problem. Well, the days accumulated, 7 of them, then 10. Then 2 weeks and the marks she'd been making on the inside cover of the Baldwin, small, neat, a private calendar, reached 14. She exercised every morning in the space beside the bookshelves because her body needed it, and because discipline was the one thing keeping her from the particular despair that came with Trapped. She read. She cataloged. She mapped every guard rotation with the obsessive precision she usually applied to primary sources, and she built in her mind a version of escape that required the service corridor door to be left unsecured for 40 seconds and a specific guard named Young Soo to be on his phone during the elevator bay gap, which happened twice on Tuesdays. She was patient. She had learned patience the way you learn things from watching someone you love practice them wrong. Her mother's version had been endurance, a passive thing, a waiting for circumstances to change. Imani had decided somewhere around age 15 that patience without a plan was just suffering with better vocabulary. She had a plan. It was fragile and depended on several variables she couldn't fully control, but it was a plan. What she hadn't planned for was Tae-jun himself. He came in the evenings. Not every evening. Sometimes 3 nights would pass without him appearing, and she'd hear from Misuk in oblique terms that he was dealing with something, which meant anything from a board meeting to something she didn't want to think about too carefully. But when he came, he stayed for an hour or two, and he never apologized for his presence the way people sometimes apologize for taking up space. He occupied the room the way he occupied everything, completely, without performing it. He brought books twice, both times without announcing he was going to. The first time it was a collection of essays by Saidiya Hartman, which she was already familiar with but hadn't read in 2 years and picked up immediately. The second time it was 3 novels she'd never heard of. 2 Korean, 1 written in English by a Vietnamese-American author, with a brief handwritten note inside the first one that said only, "I thought the argument in chapter 2 would annoy you. I was right." She didn't know how he'd read it ahead of her. She didn't ask. She read chapter 2 and it did annoy her, and she was furious at herself for finding that funny. Their evenings became arguments, not performances, real arguments, with the kind of friction that came from 2 people who were both accustomed to being right in rooms where no one challenged them. He made statements about literature as a form of political escape. She told him that was a lazy reading and explained at length why he was wrong. He pushed back. She pushed back harder. Maisuk, passing through once during one of these exchanges, looked between them with an expression so carefully neutral it was almost its own opinion. One night Imani said, "Your brother wanted to build something, legitimate businesses, real structures. You said you dismissed the idea." Tae-jun stilled. "Why?" she said. "Why did you tell him no?" He looked at his glass for a long moment. "Because it wasn't possible. You believed that or you told yourself that? The organization had obligations, people who depended on the structure of what we had. Dismantling it wasn't necessary," she said. He stopped. She watched the word land, watched him sit with it. "He was 29, Tae-jun said. Not angry. Just tired in a way that sounded older than 35. He believed the world was willing to become something different if you asked it correctly. I thought I was protecting him from learning it wasn't." He turned the glass slowly in both hands. "He died anyway, and I was wrong about what I was protecting him from." Silence. Imani said, "You blame yourself." "I blame Malcolm Brooks. And yourself." He didn't answer, which was its own answer. She leaned back against the couch cushion. The lamp at her end was warm. She'd adjusted it on the third day and kept it that way. When I was 17, I told my mother to leave him. I sat down with her at the kitchen table and I had bus schedules and the address of a shelter and the phone number for a woman I'd found who helped people in her situation relocate. I had the whole thing laid out. She paused. She told me I didn't understand love. Tae-jun was watching her. I told her I understood it fine, and what she was describing wasn't it. Imani looked at the middle distance. She stayed for 4 more years. I left at 18. Sent her money when I had it. Called every week until the calls started being painful, and then we both pretended they weren't until they were too painful to pretend about. She breathed. She died while I was here, 8 months ago. Heart. She looked at him. Not from his hands, but from carrying everything his hands built around her. Tae-jun said nothing for a long moment. Then, I'm sorry. Don't be sorry. Just understand that I know exactly what you sound like when you're blaming yourself for something you couldn't fix and calling it someone else's fault. I invented that. She held his eyes. Your brother died because of Malcolm, and you let him walk into it because you decided what was possible. Both things are true. Living with both is the thing. Something crossed Tae-jun's face that she'd never seen there. It wasn't pain exactly. Pain he wore like old weather, like something experienced so often it had stopped having a distinct feeling. This was something closer to exposure, like a word had gotten somewhere his composure hadn't been watching. He stood, straightened his jacket. Good night, Imani, he said. First time he'd used her first name without a qualifier. She watched him go, sat alone for a long time after. She was in trouble. She recognized it the way you recognize the moment a current in the water changes direction. Not a dramatic shift, just a subtle pull that means you're no longer going where you thought you were going. She'd been managing her feelings about this man the way she managed difficult texts. Critical distance, close reading, systematic doubt. It was working less well now. His grief for his brother was real. His guilt was real. The intelligence behind his eyes was real. None of that made him safe. None of it changed the seal on the windows or the guards in the corridor or the fact that she was here because he'd chosen to use her. She pressed her palms against her knees and forced herself to finish the thought she'd been avoiding for 3 days. There was also the nausea. She'd been ignoring it with the same practiced discipline she applied to everything else she couldn't afford to deal with yet. The tiredness she'd attributed to stress. The sensitivity to smell. Maisuk's cleaning product, the particular cologne one of the guards wore, she'd attributed to heightened anxiety responses. She was good at attribution. She'd gotten a graduate degree in explaining things. She was also 24 years old and knew her own body, and she had been ignoring the timeline of her last period with the kind of determined inattention that was itself a form of knowing. The man's name was David. I was a doctoral student at a different university, American, kind, in a simple, uncomplicated way she'd found restful after years of complex people. They'd seen each other 3 times over 6 weeks. The last time was 11 days before her abduction. It had been gentle and unplanned, and neither of them had called it more than it was. She sat with this knowledge for a long time in the quiet of the penthouse above Seoul. Then she thought about what it meant to be pregnant inside the home of a man who was using her as leverage against her father. What it would mean if Tae-jun knew. What it would mean as a bargaining position, as vulnerability, as information in the hands of someone whose entire architecture was built on knowing which pressure points to apply. She wasn't going to tell him. She wasn't going to tell anyone. She needed to be sure first, and being sure required something she didn't have access to in a sealed penthouse without asking for it, which meant telling Misuk, which meant it would reach Tae-jun before nightfall. Unless. She thought about Young-soo and the Tuesday gap in the service corridor door. She thought about how the next Tuesday was 4 days away. She thought about the test she'd seen in the supply cabinet 3 weeks ago when Misuk had briefly left it open while unloading a delivery. Feminine hygiene products, over-the-counter medications, first aid supplies. Organized by category. Comprehensive. The kind of supply list put together by someone who had anticipated a woman living here for an extended period and tried to be thorough about it. The cabinet locked. But the lock was a household push button, not a security mechanism. She spent the next 2 hours thinking about how to open a push-button cabinet lock with materials available in a luxury penthouse, and the answer was simpler than she wanted it to be. And when she finally slept, it was not peacefully, but it was with the determination that she was going to know the truth before she made another move. The cabinet lock took her 12 minutes and a credit card she'd kept in her bra since the first morning. They hadn't searched her thoroughly, which was either oversight or deliberate, and she'd decided it didn't matter. What mattered was that it worked. The card slipped the mechanism on the third attempt, and the door swung open quietly at 2 in the morning, while the corridor outside was at its lowest point between guard rotations. She found what she needed, took it back to the bathroom, waited. Sat on the edge of the cold tile with the results in her hand and understood completely, with total clarity, that her situation had just transformed into something she had no map for. She was pregnant. She was a prisoner. And the man who held the keys did not know either of these things. She pressed the back of her hand against her mouth and breathed through it, did not make a sound, did not cry, because she'd promised herself, and because sound carried in quiet buildings, and she would not give this penthouse her panic. She wrapped the test in tissue, buried it at the bottom of the waste bin under other material, washed her hands, looked at herself in the mirror for a long time. She was going to protect this. Whatever happened next, whatever Tae-jun decided, whatever her father did, whatever this careful revenge looked like from the inside when it finally moved, she was going to protect this absolutely, and nobody in this building was going to know until she decided that knowing served her. The decision felt solid, rational, controlled. She held it for exactly 48 hours. On the third morning, she was in the kitchen making tea when the smell of the stock Mi-suk was preparing hit the back of her throat without warning, and she put the kettle down and made it to the sink and did not make it calm or quiet. And Mi-suk was there in 3 seconds with a hand on her back saying something in Korean, soft and practical. And Imani said, "I'm fine, it's nothing," while her whole body argued with that completely. She straightened, rinsed her mouth, turned around. Mi-suk was looking at her with eyes that had already arrived at the answer to the question Imani hadn't asked, with the expression of a woman who had spent decades in rooms full of things that weren't her business, that she'd had to make her business to do her job. "No," Imani said immediately. "Mi-suk, no, please." The housekeeper looked at her for a long moment. Then she turned back to the stove, adjusted the flame under the stock, and said nothing, moved to the refrigerator, returned with ginger, set it beside the kettle. "For the tea," Mi-suk said quietly. "Ginger helps." Imani stood very still. "It helps," Mi-suk said again, not looking at her. "I had 2 children, I remember." The silence between them was the kind that contained a negotiation and a mercy and a question all at once. Imani said very quietly, "How long before he knows?" Mi-suk kept her eyes on the stove. "That depends on you," she said. It was the most complicated answer Imani had received since arriving in this building. She stood in the kitchen above the Han River with ginger in her hand, and the full weight of what was now true settling into her chest like something she would have to carry carefully from here forward. And she understood that whatever fragile control she'd maintained over the past 2 weeks had just shifted beneath her feet. The city moved below the windows, indifferent and continuous, and somewhere in the building below her, Seo Tae-jun was making decisions that affected her life, without knowing that the single most important variable in this entire situation had just changed everything. Tae-jun found out on a Thursday, not from Mi-suk. That was the thing Imani kept returning to afterward, the detail that refused to settle cleanly. Mi-suk had kept her word, or kept whatever the arrangement between them was, that silence built from ginger tea and a careful set of eyes pointed at the stove. For 11 days, the housekeeper had said nothing, done nothing, except quietly adjust what appeared on the kitchen counter in the mornings. Plain crackers alongside the rice, ginger in everything, smaller portions more frequently, nothing with strong oil. If Tae-jun noticed the changes in the kitchen inventory, he gave no sign of it. It was the physician who told him. Not intentionally, not with malice. Dr. Han Sung-ho arrived on a Thursday afternoon for what Tae-jun had apparently arranged as a routine health check, something Imani hadn't been informed about, which was its own kind of statement about whose comfort this penthouse was actually organized around. Han was a quiet man in his late 40s with careful hands and the particular manner of a doctor who had spent years treating people who couldn't go to hospitals. He examined her blood pressure, her reflexes, asked standard questions in accented but functional English. Then he asked about her last menstrual period with the same neutral clinical tone he'd used for everything else, and Imani's pause lasted 1 second too long. Han looked at her, not with accusation, with the specific gravity of a man who had just understood something and was calculating what it meant for everyone in the room. "Miss Brooks," he said carefully. "I'm fine," she said. "I'm fine." He was quiet for a moment. Then he wrote something in his notebook, closed it, and stood. "I'll need to run some additional tests," he said. "Blood work. To be thorough." She said, "Dr. Han." He met her eyes. "Please," she said. That one word cost her more than everything else she'd said in this building combined. She didn't use please as a reflex. Her mother had, constantly, reflexively. It had meant nothing by the end. When Imani said please, she meant it as a transaction, a real one. She was offering something in exchange for something else, and both parties knew it. Han held her gaze for 3 seconds. Then he nodded, very slightly, and left. She thought it was enough. It wasn't. She didn't know what he said to Tae-jun or how he framed it, whether it was direct disclosure or something more oblique. A recommendation about dietary adjustments, a question about whether the household was aware of certain conditions requiring specific care. She didn't know because Tae-jun never told her what Han said. What she knew was that Tae-jun came to the main room that evening earlier than usual, without food, without a book, without any of the props that usually organized their evenings. And he stood in the center of the room and looked at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Not anger, not satisfaction, not the controlled assessment he applied to most things. Something rawer, something he hadn't had time to compose. "How long?" he said. Imani put down the book she'd been holding without reading. She'd known this conversation was coming from the moment Han's pen had moved across that notebook. She'd had 11 days before that and another several hours since to decide how she was going to handle it. She'd run through versions: defensive, aggressive, deflective, preemptive. She'd settled on the one that required the most from her and cost her the most to do. The truth. "I found out 3 weeks ago," she said. "I was already pregnant when your men picked me up off that sidewalk." He didn't move. "And you hid it?" "Yes." "Why?" She looked at him steadily. "Because I'm a prisoner in your building and you're using me as a weapon against my father. And I didn't know what you'd do with the information." Something moved across his face at the word prisoner. Not guilt. She wasn't sure guilt was something he had easy access to. More like a man hearing a word he'd been using a particular way and understanding suddenly that someone else's definition of it was also correct. "Who is the father?" he said. "Someone who has nothing to do with you or my father or any of this." Her voice stayed level. "Someone who doesn't know I'm here. Someone I am not going to let become part of whatever this is." Tae-jun was quiet for a long time. He moved to the window and stood with his back to her, looking out at the city. The Han River was dark. The lights of Yeouido were scattered across the water in broken fragments. He stood like that for long enough that the silence stopped being uncomfortable and became something else. A man actually thinking rather than preparing to speak. He turned around. "The child is not part of this," he said. She hadn't expected that. She'd prepared for negotiation, for leverage, for the clinical repositioning of information. She hadn't prepared for a flat declaration delivered without conditions. "I want that to be clear," he said. "Whatever arrangement exists between your father and me, whatever happens with this situation, the child is not involved. Not as information, not as leverage, not as anything." Imani watched him. "Why?" He seemed to consider whether to answer. "Min Jae," he said finally, "was going to have children. He used to talk about it. A house outside the city. A garden." He stopped, looked at the floor for a second. "He never got that. Because of your father's decision and because of my failure to protect him." He raised his eyes. "I am not going to let Malcolm Brooks take that from someone else." The room held still. Imani said, "You're not doing this for me. I'm doing it because it's right. The reasons don't need to be entirely about you for the action to matter." She sat with that for a moment. "I need a doctor. A real prenatal appointment, not a check that Han does here in 40 minutes. I'll arrange it. Discreetly. If my father finds out, he won't. You don't know that." "I know my own operations," he said, with a sharpness that was the first clean edge of impatience she'd heard from him. Then quieter. "I know my own operations." She nodded once. "Then we have an agreement." "We have an agreement." He moved toward the elevator. She watched his back. "Tae-jun." He stopped. Thank you, she said, because it was true, and because she was not her mother, and she did not use words she didn't mean. He didn't turn around. Get some sleep, he said. Han will come back tomorrow with proper vitamins. The elevator took him down. Imani sat in the quiet and understood that something in the architecture of this situation had just shifted in a direction neither of them had planned for, and that the shift was permanent, and that she was not sure whether it made her safer or the opposite.
Sir.
3 days later, Tae-jun's organization started coming apart. It began quietly, the way serious damage always begins. Not with a visible break, but with pressure in places that shouldn't have pressure. A shipment held at Incheon without explanation. 2 of his legitimate companies flagged for audit by Korean financial regulators on the same morning, which was a statistical improbability that was not, in fact, probability. A call from an attorney in New York informing him that 3 of his American accounts had been frozen pending investigation. Imani knew none of this until she heard Tae-jun's voice through the service corridor door at 11 at night. Low, fast, in Korean she couldn't fully follow, but the register of it needed no translation. That was a man managing a crisis with the controlled intensity of someone who had practiced crisis management for years and was encountering something that exceeded his practice. She heard a name repeated several times, Kwon Jun-seok. The second-in-command she'd heard referenced in fragments over the past weeks. A name spoken now with a specific quality that made her stomach tighten. In the morning, Tae-jun looked like a man who had not slept. He sat at the table with coffee and a laptop and didn't acknowledge her presence when she came out of the bedroom, which was itself information. He always acknowledged her presence. Not warmly, not with performance, but with a nod, a brief meeting of eyes. This morning he stared at the screen and his jaw was doing something quiet and ugly, and his hands on the keyboard had a stillness that was the wrong kind. "What happened?" she said. "Nothing that concerns you. Everything that happens in this building concerns me. I'm trapped in it." He looked up. His eyes were tired in a way she hadn't seen before. "Someone is coordinating an attack on my operations. Multiple fronts. Investigators in the US and Korea. 2 rival syndicates moving on my distribution networks. Financial interference." He said it flatly, like a list. "It is systematic. It is not opportunistic. You have a leak. I have something worse than a leak. A leak loses information. This is someone who has been actively feeding strategy to multiple parties simultaneously." He looked back at the screen. "A leak is a crack. This is someone who built the crack deliberately." Imani sat down across from him. "You're second, Kwon Jun-seok." Tae-jun's eyes came back to her immediately. "You heard that. The corridor has less soundproofing than you think." He stared at her for a moment. Not angry, measuring. "Jun-seok has been with me for 11 years. I know. That's why it would be him. Long enough to know everything, trusted enough to never be fully checked, smart enough to build something over time. Loyalty isn't something you... My father had a man named Curtis who worked for him for 14 years. Curtis was the one who gave the federal task force the account numbers that eventually got 4 of Malcolm's operations shut down." She kept her voice even. "He did it slowly, over 2 years. Small pieces. Nothing traceable to one moment. And he did it because Malcolm, 11 years in, had done something Curtis couldn't forgive, and Curtis had decided that the long way was the only way that worked." She paused. 11 years doesn't make a person safe. Sometimes it just gives them more to be angry about. Tae-jun was very still. "What did you do?" she said. Not an accusation, a real question. "I don't know yet," he said. "That's what frightens me." She hadn't expected that either. She was beginning to lose count of the things from him she hadn't expected. She spent the rest of the morning looking at the financial pattern he'd printed out. He'd left it on the table when he stepped away to take a call, and she read it with the speed and comprehension of someone who had grown up watching her father's accountant's work, who had absorbed the grammar of hidden money without intending to. The pattern was there. It was subtle and it was patient, and it was wrong in a specific way that she recognized because she'd seen her father's enemies make similar moves. The transactions didn't move money, they moved timing. Information embedded in the gaps between transactions. Signal hidden in the structure of normal activity. When Tae-jun came back, she said, "It's not Jun-seok." He stopped in the doorway. "The pattern is too careful. Whoever is doing this has been doing it for years, and they've stayed invisible by staying peripheral. Jun Seok is too central. He'd have been scrutinized too many times for this to have survived this long. This is someone your security protocols never prioritized because they never looked important enough to watch. Tae-jun came fully into the room, looked at what she'd marked on the page. You read financial records. I grew up in my father's house. I listened even when they thought I wasn't. He looked at the marks she'd made. His jaw worked. These intervals matched the 2 days before every enforcement action against you in the last 14 months. I counted back from the audit notices you have in that folder. She tapped the paper. Whoever this is, they don't work at your level. They work below Jun Seok, below anyone you'd think to watch. And they have a direct communication line to at least 3 parties who all want you dismantled. He stood over the table looking at her markings for a long time. How do you know this? He said. Not accusatory, genuinely asking. Because my father did it to other people, she said. And I watched how it worked. And I always thought that someday I would need to know how to find it when someone did it to me. Tae-jun sat down slowly. He looked at her across the table, really looked, in the way he sometimes did that felt like being read rather than seen. And then he looked back at the paper. Daniel Cho, he said. The name came out of him carefully, like something he was testing the weight of. Mid-level, supply chain coordination. Been with us 4 years. Is he someone you'd have looked at? No? He said it quietly. No, he's not. Then it's probably him. Odd. She was right. She didn't know she was right for another 6 days, during which the penthouse became something different. Not a prison with ambient luxury, but a place with its own operational tempo, Tae-jun in and out at hours that had nothing to do with any routine she'd mapped. Phone calls in the corridor that didn't bother to stay quiet anymore. Mi-suk moving through the space with the particular compressed efficiency of a woman who could read a room's threat level by the quality of its silence. Imani continued her mornings. Exercise. Reading. The vitamins Han had left. She ate when she was supposed to eat, and she let herself be still when the nausea hit, which was less frequent now, but still arrived sometimes without warning. She thought about David occasionally, his specific kindness, the way he laughed at things with his whole face, and then put him away carefully in a part of her mind she wasn't going to access right now because she couldn't afford the grief of it. She thought about her mother more often, about what her mother would say if she could see this room, this situation, this man who was simultaneously her captor and the person she'd had more honest conversation with than almost anyone in the last 2 years. Her mother would recognize it immediately. That was what Imani was afraid of. On the 6th day, Tae-jun came in at 2 in the morning. She was awake. She slept lightly now, had since the first night, her body having decided that this was a situation requiring vigilance even unconscious. She heard the elevator and stayed in the bedroom doorway and watched him come into the main room. He had blood on his shirt. Not a small amount. His right hand was wrapped in a cloth that had soaked through at the knuckle. He moved to the kitchen, poured water, and drank half of it standing at the counter, and his hand shook slightly holding the glass. Not from injury, from something else, from whatever the night had required of him. Imani came into the room. He saw her, didn't tell her to go back to bed. You found him, she said. Yes. Daniel Cho. Yes. She looked at the shirt. Is he alive? Tae-jun looked at her steadily. No. She absorbed this. She'd known it was the probable outcome, had known it from the moment she'd understood what kind of organization this was and what it did with people who betrayed it. Knowing it as an abstraction and hearing it as a fact were different things. She let herself feel the difference for exactly the time it took to breathe in and out twice. Sit down, she said. Sit down. Your hand needs to be cleaned and you're not doing it standing at a counter by yourself at 2 in the morning. He looked at her for a moment. Then he sat. She found the first aid kit in the cabinet. The same cabinet, different shelf. She knew every inch of this penthouse by now, and brought it to the table. She unwrapped his hand. The knuckles were split in 2 places, already swelling, one of them deep enough to need pressure held for several minutes. She worked without speaking. He watched her hands rather than her face. He wasn't alone, Tae-jun said. Cho. I was working with 3 other organizations, Korean competitors, federal informants in the U.S., and he stopped. She looked up. Your father, he said. Malcolm Brooks has been coordinating with Cho's network for the past 8 months. He knew where you were within the first 2 weeks. The cloth in her hands went still. He knew, Tae-jun said. And he didn't come for you. He used the information to position himself with my enemies. He supplied them with intelligence about my U.S. operations in exchange for... He stopped again, looked at her face. I'm sorry. I'm sorry to tell you this way. Imani stared at the far wall. She thought about the word Tae-jun had used about her, the one person Malcolm secretly loves more than his empire. She thought about the certainty in his voice when he'd said it. She thought about 5 weeks of captivity that had apparently coincided with 5 weeks of her father deciding that her location was more useful as a bargaining chip than as a reason to act. He knew where I was, she said. Yes. And he left me here. Tae-jun said nothing. There was nothing to say. She pressed the cloth against his knuckles and held it there, and the pressure required no thought, her hands doing the work on their own, while the rest of her processed the full architecture of what she'd just been told. She'd known her father was capable of terrible things, had organized her entire adult life around that knowledge, had put an ocean between them at 18 and kept it there. But there is a particular kind of devastation that comes from having your most carefully defended pessimism proven insufficient. She had thought she'd stopped hoping for Malcolm Brooks to be different. Apparently some small, irrational part of her had been wrong about that. The grief of it moved through her in a wave and receded and left something cleaner behind. Not forgiveness. She wasn't built for fast forgiveness. Something more like clarity. The last attachment she hadn't fully examined just severed itself, and it hurt, and then it was done. She realized her hands were still on Tae-jun's. She didn't remove them. He looked down at them, and then at her, and something passed between them that neither of them named. Not romance, the situation didn't allow for anything that clean, something more elemental. The specific recognition between two people who have both just confirmed that the people who were supposed to protect them made other choices. Who else was in Cho's network, she said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of how steady her voice was. A man named Park Dae-hyun, Korean Syndicate, Eastern Operations, 2 federal contacts in New York, and someone inside my own structure above Cho. He paused. Kwon Jun-seok's daughter was taken 3 weeks ago. Used to force Jun-seok's partial cooperation with Cho's information gathering. Jun-seok came to me tonight. That's how we found Cho. Jun-seok isn't the traitor. No, he's a man who chose his daughter over his loyalty, and I can't... He stopped. His voice had developed an edge she hadn't heard before. I can't tell him he made the wrong decision. The first aid kit sat open between them. The city outside was its own universe of movement and indifference, somewhere below this building. Tae-jun's organization was reorganizing itself around a wound she'd helped locate, and her father was probably in a room she'd never see, making a calculation that no longer included her. She closed the first aid kit. Your operation is compromised, she said. Cho is gone, but the people he was working with still have everything he gave them. The federal contacts, the Korean syndicates, they're not going to stop because you removed one piece. No. So you're about to be hit from multiple directions simultaneously. Yes. She looked at him. And I'm still in this building. Yes. He held her gaze. And the building is now a target. The statement landed with the weight it deserved. She was sitting across from a man telling her that the place she was imprisoned in had just become a place that other people were planning to attack. And the irony of it was so grotesque that she almost laughed. Almost, except that her child was 12 weeks along and the building they were both sitting in had bulletproof windows and armed men and was still, suddenly, the most dangerous place she could be. I need you to listen to me, she said. I'm listening. Whatever you're planning, counterattack, defensive positioning, whatever the next move is, you need to tell me. Not everything, not operational details, but enough that I can make decisions about myself. I'm not going to sit in a room and wait to find out what's happening to me by watching it happen. He was silent for a moment. I am carrying a child, she said, and my father just proved that nobody in the world is going to put my safety ahead of their own position. Which means the only person in this building I can rely on to account for my safety is me. She held his eyes. So, tell me what's coming. Tae-jun looked at her for a long moment. The cloth on his hand had stiffened. The city went on outside the glass, vast and ongoing and completely unaware. The attack will come within the week, he said. They'll move before we can reorganize. Multiple entry points, coordinated. They want the building controlled and me... He paused. They want me unable to respond. And me? You would be used as leverage in a different configuration. Return to your father in exchange for his continued cooperation with their network, most likely. He'd take that deal. I believe so. Yes. She sat with this. Her father's calculation laid out plainly, no softening. She was a resource to be repositioned. She had been one all her life without fully believing it until tonight. All right, she said. All right. Then we need to talk about what I know, she said. About how my father operates. About how he'd communicate with these people, and what his patterns look like, and where his exposures are. She straightened. Because I grew up in that house, and I know things about Malcolm Brooks's operational habits that you've never had access to. And if you're going to survive what's coming, you're going to need every advantage you don't currently have. Tae-jun stared at her. I am not doing this for you, she said, before he could speak. I'm doing it because I'm not going back to my father's custody, and I'm not going to have this child inside whatever cage his allies would put me in. And right now, the only functional path forward is through you. She looked at him steadily. So use me correctly, not as bait, not as leverage, as someone who actually knows the enemy you're fighting. The silence held for a beat. Then Tae-jun said, quietly, and with a certainty that sounded like something he hadn't planned to feel, I don't think I've been using you correctly for some time. Outside the sealed windows, Seoul moved through its night without them, and somewhere in its lower levels something was being organized that would arrive before the week was out. And the two people sitting across from each other in a fortified penthouse above the Han River had just made a decision that neither of them could take back, and both of them knew it, and neither of them looked away. They worked through the night, not together in any warm sense of the word, side by side at the table with the financial records and the printed communication logs. Tae-jun's people had pulled from Cho's devices before the body was dealt with, two people who had decided that surviving the next week required pooling everything they knew, and neither of them had the luxury of pretending otherwise. Mi-suk brought tea at 3 a.m. without being asked and left without a word. The guards rotated outside. The city below them moved through its dark hours, indifferent and continuous. Imani talked about Malcolm the way she'd never talked about him to anyone. Not the emotional truth of him, not tonight, but the operational truth. The way he communicated when he didn't want records. The code structures his lieutenants used in financial transfers that looked like vendor payments. The specific pattern of his aggression when he felt cornered. He always hit the perimeter first, tested edges, looked for the place where the defense was thinnest before committing his real force. He was not a man who charged the center. He was a man who found the door that wasn't locked and walked through it quietly, and by the time you knew he was inside, he had already positioned himself at your back. Tae-jun listened to all of it without interrupting. He took notes in Korean on a separate pad, and occasionally asked questions that were precise and technical and showed he understood exactly what she was describing and why it mattered. He was good at this. The absorption of intelligence, the reorganization of it into strategy. She watched him work and understood for the first time the full shape of what he was. Not simply a violent man who had built a criminal organization, but a man with genuine strategic intelligence who had chosen a particular field to apply it in, the way someone else with the same mind might have chosen finance or law or medicine. She thought about Min Jae, who had seen that and believed it could be redirected. She thought about this later, not now. Now she was working. By 4:30 in the morning, they had a framework. By 6, they had something that was closer to a real plan. Built from her knowledge of Malcolm's patterns and Tae-jun's knowledge of the Korean syndicates and the specific vulnerabilities that Cho's network had exposed in both. It wasn't a comfortable plan. It required Tae-jun to appear weaker than he was, which meant allowing certain attacks to land. It required Imani to be visibly present in the building, which she hated and which he hated more, and which they both understood was necessary, because if Malcolm's allies believed she'd been moved or hidden, they would shift their approach and the timing would collapse. You're using yourself as bait, Tae-jun said. Not a question. We're using me as the thing that keeps their attention where we want it. She corrected the framing the way she corrected imprecise readings in a seminar. There's a difference. The difference is academic if the building is breached. Then don't let the building be breached. He looked at her for a long moment. You're not afraid. I'm terrified, she said. I've been terrified since the sidewalk. Fear isn't the same as paralysis, and I refuse to let it be. He looked at her differently after that. She noticed. She filed it away in the part of her mind that was keeping track of things she wasn't going to examine until this was over. Not. The attack came on a Tuesday, 4 days after their night at the table. 4 days of Tae-jun's organization moving quietly, repositioning, passing false information through the channels they'd identified as compromised, letting Cho's dead network believe it was still operational. 4 days of Imani maintaining her visible routine in the penthouse, moving in front of the windows at intervals, appearing in sightlines that the external surveillance they'd identified would register, being present and locatable and apparently unaware. 4 days of Maisuk pressing ginger tea into her hands every morning and not saying anything about the way Imani's hands weren't quite steady until the second cup. The day itself started normally enough that she almost believed the plan had worked too well, that the threat had miscalculated and pulled back. She'd done her morning exercise. She'd eaten. She'd sat with a book she wasn't reading, watching the light move across the river in the particular way it moved on clear autumn mornings. And she was in the middle of thinking about something completely unrelated to any of this, a paragraph she'd been trying to write before her abduction, a specific problem with her argument about spatial memory in Morrison that she hadn't solved. When the building's emergency lighting dropped to red and the sound of the elevator mechanism changed, not stopping, overriding, Maisuk was across the room in 3 seconds, not panicking, moving with the compressed speed of a woman who had been told what to do in this situation and had memorized it completely. "Come," she said. One word, hand extended. "Where are—" "Now, Miss Brooks, please." They moved through the service corridor. The door was open, had been left open at Tae-jun's instruction 3 days ago, and relocked on a mechanism that could be released from the inside. And through a secondary passage Imani had never been shown, narrower, utilitarian, the honest bones of the building behind its curated surfaces. Maisuk moved fast for a woman her age and didn't look back to check whether Imani was keeping up, which Imani found she respected. The safe room was behind a panel in the building's structural wall that looked like maintenance access, and opened with Maisuk's palm against a specific section of the frame. Steel door, maybe 4 inches thick, hydraulic close. The room inside was small, 8 feet by 10, reinforced concrete, ventilation system, a bench along one wall, a first aid kit, water, a communication panel with a single line that Maisuk activated immediately. Then the shooting started. Imani had heard gunfire before. Malcolm's world was not quiet, but not like this. Not from inside the structure of a building, not transmitted through concrete and steel, so that it became a low, irregular percussion that you felt in your chest cavity before your ears fully processed it. Maisuk sat down on the bench with her hands folded in her lap, and her expression composed into something that was not calm, but was the result of practicing calm so long it had become structural. Imani stood with her back against the wall beside the door and counted. Not shots. She couldn't distinguish individual shots through the steel. She counted her own heartbeats and used them to mark time, and refused to think about what was happening on the other side of the door in terms that had human faces attached to them. She thought about it tactically instead. Entry points, the defensive positions. Tae-jun's people had set up over the last 4 days, the false intelligence that was supposed to have split the attacking force before it reached the building. Supposed to. The word sat badly. The communication panel crackled once, static, then silence. Maisuk looked at it. "The line is being jammed," she said. "From outside?" "Yes." Imani looked at the door, 4 inches of steel, hydraulic lock. The mechanism required either the correct palm signature from inside or a specific override code from Tae-jun's command position. Neither of those things was accessible to whatever was on the other side. That was the math. That was the thing to hold on to. She held on to it. The shooting lasted, she counted heartbeats. 11 minutes. It felt longer. Everything that happens inside confined silence feels longer. Maisuk remained on the bench with her hands folded and her eyes closed, not praying, just conserving. Imani stayed standing because sitting felt like conceding something she wasn't prepared to concede. Then the shooting stopped. The silence afterward was worse. The specific silence of aftermath, which had a different texture than ordinary quiet. Imani knew this silence. She'd heard it once when she was 14, standing in a hallway in Baltimore while something resolved itself on the other side of a door she wasn't supposed to know existed. Maisuk opened her eyes. They waited. 3 minutes. 4. 5. The override code came through on the panel. Not a voice, a sequence of tones. 4 specific ones in a specific order that Mi-suk had told her on the first night meant the senior person in the operation was still functional and the room was clear. Mi-suk stood, moved to the door mechanism, and entered the response sequence. The hydraulics released. The door swung open. Tae-jun was standing in the corridor. He'd been shot. She knew it before she fully processed the visual. She knew it from the way he was standing, the particular compensation in his posture. The weight shifted off his left side in the way a body does when it's protecting something without being instructed to. His jacket was gone. The left side of his shirt was dark and wrong. He looked at her face first. "The baby," he said. She stared at him. "We're fine. How bad?" "We need to move to the secondary floor. The elevator is—" He shifted his weight, and the shift cost him something visible. His jaw locked against it. "The elevator is being secured. We take the stairs." "You've been shot." "Yes." "Tae-jun?" "Stairs," he said. "Now. We can have this argument on the secondary floor." She came out of the safe room and looked at the corridor. 2 of his men were managing the space with the efficient grimness of people cleaning up after something she was choosing not to look at directly. Mi-suk was already moving. Imani went to Tae-jun's right side, his good side, without deciding to, just put herself there, close enough that if his balance shifted, she'd be a surface to catch against. He looked at her. Something complicated moved across his face. "I can walk." "I know," she said. "Walk then." They took the stairs 2 floors down to the secondary operations space, a floor she'd had no access to, set up as a functional command center with communications equipment and several people she recognized from the penthouse security rotation, all of them operating with the accelerated focus of people managing a situation that had not gone entirely according to plan, but had not gone catastrophically wrong either. Not yet. Tae-jun sat in a chair and didn't argue when one of his men immediately went for the first aid supplies. Imani stood beside him and watched his face and monitored the color of it and tracked his breathing the way she'd been monitoring her own for weeks. Kwon Jun-seok was in the room. He looked like a man who had been awake for 72 hours and had stopped caring about that fact some time ago. I was on a phone call, speaking low and fast, and he looked up when they came in, and the look he gave Tae-jun contained something complicated: relief, guilt, and a loyalty that had survived being tested in ways that would have broken a simpler version of it. Tae-jun said, "Report." Jun-seok ended the call. 2 teams. One at the building, one at the MAPO office. The building team was the decoy. They came in expecting a straight breach and hit the positions we'd prepared. 7 of theirs down, 2 of ours injured. He paused. The MAPO team was the real operation. They went for the server room. Did they get it? No, we moved everything 48 hours ago. Tae-jun exhaled slowly. And Dae-hyun? Still in the wind. He didn't come himself. He sent people and watched the results from somewhere we haven't located yet. The federal contacts in New York? Anonymous tips went out last night. Financial irregularities, specific account numbers, communication records. If the tips land the way we structured them, 3 of Dae-hyun's people in the U.S. face federal exposure by end of week. Jun-seok glanced at Imani briefly. Not unfriendly, curious. The Malcolm Brooks material is processed and ready. Tae-jun looked at the floor for a moment, then at Imani. "This is the part," he said, "where I need to tell you something." She kept her expression neutral. "Tell me, the evidence we have on Malcolm's U.S. operations, the account structures, the communication chains, the connections to Cho's network and to Dae-hyun's alliance, it's enough. Enough for federal prosecution. Enough to dismantle everything he's built." He held her eyes steadily. "We've prepared a package for federal investigators. Anonymous. It goes out with the rest." She absorbed this. "You're destroying his empire." "He participated in a coordinated attack on my organization. He knew where you were and used that information as currency with my enemies. His operation has been funding violence in 3 countries for the past decade." Tae-jun's voice was even. "I am not going to pretend that doesn't deserve consequences, because the consequences will hurt you." She looked at him for a long time. The man managing her father's wound was doing something with gauze and medical tape that Tae-jun was ignoring with the determined discipline of someone who had learned to process physical pain as background noise. "You could have told me this was part of the plan," she said. "I'm telling you now." "That's not the same thing." "No," he said. "It isn't." She turned away, looked at the room. the screens, the people moving with purpose. The operation she'd helped redesign over 4 sleepless nights, now playing out in real time. She thought about Malcolm Brooks in whatever room he was sitting in, watching his allies fail to deliver what they'd promised, beginning to understand that something had gone wrong. She thought about what it would mean for him when the federal package landed. She thought about her mother's hands on that kitchen table, shaking. She turned back around. Is it enough to actually hold him? The evidence? Yes. Yes, Tae-jun said. It's enough. She nodded once. Then send it. Jun Seok looked at Tae-jun. Tae-jun looked at Imani. She held his gaze and didn't look away. And after a moment he said to Jun Seok, send it. Park Dae-hyun surfaced 36 hours later. Not in person, through a phone call to a number that should have been secure, routed through 3 different systems, which meant either his operational security had developed a hole or he wanted to be heard, and this was theater. Tae-jun took the call on speaker in the secondary operations room with Jun Seok and 2 other senior people and Imani sitting against the far wall, where Tae-jun had looked at her when she walked in and not told her to leave, which was its own kind of statement. Dae-hyun's voice was Korean accented, older, with the particular smoothness of a man who was accustomed to speaking and having the room go quiet. He expressed regret about the attack on the building. He expressed regret about injuries sustained. He spoke about the unfortunate collapse of their mutual associate, Cho, and about how misunderstandings at this level of operation tended to produce costly outcomes for everyone. He was offering a conversation. Tae-jun let him finish. Then he said, "You sent men into my building." A pause. "A misunderstanding in the execution. You sent men into a building where a pregnant woman was sheltering," Tae-jun said. His voice had dropped into a register Imani hadn't heard before. Not louder. The opposite. "And you're calling to discuss misunderstandings." Another pause. Dae-hyun recalibrated. "The woman is unharmed." "She is." "Then perhaps we can—" "I'm going to tell you something," Tae-jun said, "and I want you to understand that I'm telling you this not as a threat, but as information, because you're going to need accurate information to make a correct decision in the next 48 hours. He paused. "You have 4 people in the United States whose financial activity and communication records are currently in the possession of federal investigators. You have 3 shell companies in Singapore that will be frozen by end of week based on material that was delivered this morning. And you have a partner, Malcolm Brooks, who is going to be occupied with his own federal situation for the foreseeable future, which means the alliance you built this operation on no longer exists." Silence on the line. "What you do with the next 48 hours, Tae-jun said, is your decision, but I'd recommend you make it with accurate information." He ended the call. The room was quiet for a moment. Jun Seok exhaled slowly. One of the other men said something in Korean that was clearly some variation of acknowledgement. Imani said, "That was the information play." Tae-jun looked at her. "Yes. You're not going after him directly. Going after him directly costs more than I'm willing to spend right now." He paused. "And someone told me recently that the most powerful weapon available to me was accurate information deployed at the right moment." She looked at him. "I said that?" "You implied it, loudly, through several hours of strategic argument." She felt something in her chest that she was not going to name in a room full of people who were not part of whatever was developing between them. She looked at the communication screen. "He'll pull back?" "For now, his network is too exposed to push forward. He'll consolidate, regroup, and in 6 months he'll be someone else's problem." "And Malcolm?" Tae-jun was quiet for a moment. "The federal package was received and acknowledged this morning. It will take time. These things always take time. But the account structures are clear. The communication records are clear." He looked at her. "It will hold." She nodded, pressed her back against the wall, and looked at the ceiling for a moment. The adrenaline of the last day and a half was beginning to metabolize into something heavier and more exhausting. The specific fatigue that followed sustained threat. The body understanding it was allowed to process now. "I need to sit down properly," she said, "not against a wall." Misuk appeared from somewhere. The woman had an instinct for necessary moments. With the chair and a cup of something warm, Imani sat in it and held the cup in both hands and let herself breathe. Tae-jun watched her from across the room. She felt it without looking up. I was worse than he'd been letting on. She discovered this at 10 that night when the controlled competence he'd been running on since the safe room door opened finally began to show its seams. He was at a table reviewing something when she noticed his left hand had stopped moving, and he was very still in the particular way of a man managing pain that had gotten louder than his management strategies. She crossed the room, crouched in front of him. "How bad?" she said. "It's fine. Tae-jun." He looked at her. His face was too controlled, which was how she knew. The composure he wore like a second skin had gotten rigid rather than fluid, and rigid composure was composure that was working very hard. "The bullet passed through," he said. "Han stitched it this morning. It's infected or it's bleeding again," she said. "Which one?" "A beat." "Bleeding, slightly." "Slightly," she repeated. "The stitching needs to be redone. Han is... Where's the kit?"
Imani, ha.
"Where is it?" He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't fully parse. Exasperation and something beneath it, something that didn't have a simple name. Then he told her where the kit was. She redressed the wound herself, which required him to take off his shirt, which she managed without making it into anything it wasn't. Focused on the injury with the same clinical attention she'd applied to his knuckles 3 nights ago in a different room that felt like a different world. The wound was clean, but the original stitching had pulled. He'd been moving too much, doing too much, running an operation on a body that needed to be horizontal. She worked carefully. Her hands were steadier than she would have expected. He was quiet through most of it. Then, "You keep doing this. Keeping you from bleeding out? It's purely selfish. You're the only person in this building who argues back." Something shifted in his face. Almost a smile, but reaching further than his almost smiles usually reached. "I mean, putting yourself in the position of caring for someone who is not safe to care for." She secured the last piece of tape. "You're not going to hurt me. You don't know that. I know it." She sat back on her heels and looked at him. "You're a man who decided an unborn child was off limits before you knew whether the child could be useful to you. That's not a calculation. That's a reflex. People's reflexes tell you who they are more than anything they say about themselves." He was looking at her in that way again, the reading way. "You've been watching me. You've been watching me since the first night. It goes both ways." I was quiet for a moment, then, "Minja used to say that I'd spent so many years deciding what was impossible that I'd forgotten how to see what was actually there." His voice was different when he talked about his brother, not softer exactly, but like a room where the furniture had been removed and you could hear the actual dimensions. "I told him he was being naive. He told me I was being cowardly." He paused. "He wasn't wrong." Imani said, "He sounds like he was worth knowing. I was the best person I've ever known. Simple. No decoration." I keep thinking, if he could see this situation, what he would say about it. "What do you think he'd say?" Tae-jun looked at her for a long moment. "I think he'd say that I'd found an extremely complicated way to meet someone." The silence that followed was different from the silences that had been filling this room all night. It had a different temperature. Imani stood up, closed the first aid kit, set it on the table with more care than it required. "Get some sleep," she said. "You're no good to anyone bleeding into your own shirt." "That's sleep, Tae-jun." He looked at her. Then with the slow, deliberate movement of a man who has decided to comply, not because he was told to, but because the logic is sound. "You as well." She nodded, moved toward the door of the secondary room they'd converted to sleeping quarters, stopped with her hand on the frame. "The plan," she said. "The original one. Malcolm breaks. You keep me until he does. You let me go." She didn't turn around. "Is that still the plan?" She heard him breathing, heard the shift of his weight in the chair. "No," he said. "It isn't." She stood in the doorway for another second. Then she went through it, and the door closed, and she sat on the edge of the narrow bed in the dark and pressed both hands flat against her sternum and held them there until her heartbeat settled into something she could live with. The next 72 hours were the kind of hours that rearranged the furniture of a person's understanding. The federal acknowledgement became a formal investigation. Malcolm Brooks's legal team was notified. His primary accounts were frozen within 48 hours, which meant his operating capital seized up in the way a river seizes when the dam closes, suddenly and completely, all the downstream movement stopping at once. His lieutenants, without access to the financial structures they depended on, began making the calculations that people in their position always made when the math changed. Who was safer to cooperate with than to protect? Two of them cooperated within the first week. Dae-hyun pulled his remaining Seoul operations back behind a defensive perimeter and sent no further communication. The Korean authorities, working from material that had reached them through channels that would take years to fully trace, began examining Dae-hyun's legitimate holdings with the specific attention of people who had been given a roadmap. Tae-jun's organization, wounded and restructured and running leaner than it had in years, held. Jun Seok's daughter was returned, found in an apartment in Incheon, physically unharmed, by people whose methods Imani did not ask about. Jun Seok came to Tae-jun afterward and said something that was clearly an apology and an accounting of what he'd done and an offer of whatever consequence Tae-jun decided was appropriate. Tae-jun said something back. Imani watched from across the room and couldn't hear the words, but she saw Jun Seok's posture change, the specific change of a person who has been given something they didn't expect to receive, and she thought she understood what Tae-jun had said without needing to hear it. On the fourth day after the attack, Tae-jun came to where she was sitting in the main room. They'd returned to the penthouse level, the damage cleared, the windows intact, the Han River back in its position below them as if nothing had changed. And he sat down across from her and looked at her with an expression that was the most openly uncertain she'd ever seen on his face. "I want to tell you something," he said. She set down the book. "Tell me." "You are not," he stopped, appeared to be deciding on precision. "You have not been Malcolm Brooks's daughter to me for some time. I don't know the exact moment, but you became someone else to me, and I continued operating as if the original situation was still the situation, which was—" He paused. "Wrong." She looked at him steadily. "I'm not apologizing for what I did," he said. "I'm not going to perform regret I don't fully feel because that would be dishonest. I took you off that street and I held you here, and those are facts I have to carry." He met her eyes. "But I want you to know that the person I took off that street and the person I see in this room are not the same to me anymore. And whatever comes next, open the doors," she said. He stopped. "If you mean what you're saying," Imani said, "open the doors right now. Let me leave." The silence lasted long enough that she counted her heartbeats in it. 6, 7. Tae-jun stood. He crossed to the elevator panel. He pressed the control that overrode the security lock, and the light above the doors went from red to green. And the doors opened, and the elevator was there, available, descending to a lobby that connected to a city that connected to everywhere else in the world. He stepped back. He stood with his hands at his sides. He waited. Imani looked at the open elevator. She looked at the Han River through the glass. She looked at the bookshelves, her fingerprints on half of them by now, her margin notes in the books she'd read, her 14 small marks on the inside cover of the Baldwin. She thought about the service corridor door and the plans she'd built around Young-soo and the Tuesday Gap, which she had never used, and when she asked herself honestly why she'd never used it, the answer was not comfortable. She looked at Tae-jun. I was watching her with the specific patience of a man who had decided that the outcome of this moment was not his to determine, and who was holding to that decision with everything he had. She said, "If I stay—" "You stay on your terms," he said immediately. "Completely. No guards on your movement, no restricted access, no—" "That's not what I was going to say." He stopped. "If I stay," she said, "you finish what your brother started." He was very still. Min-jae believed you could build something real, something that didn't require violence to sustain it. She held his eyes. "I will not raise my daughter in the same world that took my mother apart. I won't do it. Not for you, not for whatever this is between us, not for any version of a future that has a criminal organization underneath it." She kept her voice level. The steadiness of it was the most honest thing she'd said in weeks. "So if I stay, that is the condition. One condition. Complete. Not negotiable, not partial, not a gradual process that never finishes." The elevator doors stayed open behind her. The city was fully dark beyond the glass, and Tae-jun stood in the amber light of the room she'd been a prisoner in for 6 weeks. And the man who had built an empire around the controlled application of power stood looking at a woman who had just told him the price of the only thing he wanted, and she watched him understand that the price was real and the decision was his, and there was no version of this moment that didn't require him to choose. He looked at the open elevator. He looked at her. He looked at the river. Then he crossed the room to the elevator panel and pressed the control again, and the light went from green back to red, and the doors closed, and he turned around and faced her. "Then we start tomorrow," he said. Imani looked at him for a long moment. Something settled in her chest that had not been settled since a rainy Seoul sidewalk 6 weeks ago. Not relief exactly, not safety, but the specific solidity of a decision made with full information by a person who had chosen it freely. "Tonight," she said, "you call Jun Seok and you tell him you're beginning the transition. Tonight, while I'm in the room." She paused. "I need to see it start." He held her gaze. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone and called Jun Seok. And when the call connected, he said, in Korean, something that made Jun Seok go very quiet on the other end. And then made him ask something. And then made him go quiet again longer. And then, she heard it even through the speaker, even in a language she only partially understood, say something that sounded like the careful, complicated acknowledgement of a man who had waited a long time for a particular door to open and had not been sure he would live to hear it. Tae-jun ended the call. He stood in the middle of the room and looked at her, and his face held everything. The cost of it, the grief of Min-jae, threaded through the decision like something that would never fully separate from it. The exhaustion of 6 weeks that had dismantled whatever he'd thought this situation was going to be, and underneath all of it, something she hadn't seen on his face before in any of the evenings and arguments and silences they'd accumulated. Something that looked, in the amber light above the Han River, with the city moving below them and the rest of this unfinished between them, like a man stepping out of a very long darkness and needing a moment to let his eyes adjust. Imani said nothing. She sat back down, picked up her book, and let him have the moment. Outside, Seoul moved through its night, and somewhere in the city the pieces of everything they'd set in motion were still falling, and the man standing in the center of the room above it had just made the decision that would determine what they fell into. And nothing that happened next would be clean or simple or certain, but the door had opened and the choice had been made. And the future, for the first time since a rainy sidewalk 6 weeks ago, was a thing that Imani Brooks could see the shape of from where she was sitting. The morning after Tae-jun called Jun Seok, Imani woke before dawn and lay in the dark and listened to the building breathe. It breathed differently now. She'd learned its rhythms over 7 weeks. The elevator cycling, the guard rotation, the particular silence of 3 in the morning when the city below finally dropped below a certain threshold of noise. She knew which hour the ventilation shifted registers. She knew the sound Mi-suk made in the kitchen when she was working versus the sound she made when she was simply occupying space. She knew the building the way you know a place you've had to understand in order to survive it, which is a more complete kind of knowing than the kind that comes from simply living somewhere willingly. She lay there and understood that the building felt different, not because anything structural had changed, but because something had been decided inside it. And decisions change the quality of air in a room the way weather changes the quality of air outside. Imperceptibly, but completely. And you feel it before you can name it. She got up, dressed, went to the kitchen. Mi-suk was already there. She looked at Imani's face the way she'd looked at it every morning for 7 weeks. A quick, comprehensive assessment that took half a second and registered everything. And then she turned back to the stove and said, "Sit, eat first." Imani sat, ate. The ginger was still in the tea. She thought about what it would mean when she no longer needed ginger in the tea and felt the specific complicated feeling of something being simultaneously a burden and a thing you'd become accustomed to carrying and knew she'd have to sort that out later. Tae-jun appeared at 7. He'd slept. She could tell because the particular rigid quality of last night's exhaustion had loosened slightly. But he'd slept badly, which she could also tell because his left hand, the one on the wounded side, moved with slightly more care than it had before the injury. A compensation he was still working out. He poured coffee and looked at her and nodded once. "Jun Seok is coming at 9, he said. "I know." "You don't have to be in that meeting." "I know that too," she said. "I'll be there." He looked at her for a moment. Something in his face arranged itself into the closest thing to ease she'd ever seen there. "All right." Jun Seok arrived at 9 with 2 folders and the look of a man who had spent the night taking stock of something enormous. He was in his mid-40s, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of face that had once probably been open and had learned over decades to be careful. He looked at Imani when he came into the room and she looked back and he said, in English that was functional and deliberate, "I owe you an apology." She said, "You owe me nothing. You were protecting your daughter. I cooperated with the people who put you in danger. Under duress, while your child was held." She held his gaze. I understand the math of that decision completely. Don't apologize for it. Jun Seok looked at Tae-jun. Something passed between them. The specific communication of men who have known each other long enough that entire conversations happen in the space of a look. Then he set the folders on the table and opened the first one. What followed was 3 hours of the most detailed, consequential conversation Imani had ever sat in, and she had sat in some consequential conversations. The transition plan was not a simple document. It was a map of a complex living system, financial structures, operational dependencies, personnel obligations, territorial arrangements with other organizations that would require negotiation rather than dissolution, legal entities that needed to be restructured from the inside rather than shut down from the outside. Jun Seok had worked through the night on the framework, and it showed in the precision of it, the places where he'd anticipated problems and built around them. Imani read everything she was handed and asked questions when she had them. Nobody told her the questions were outside her purview. Tae-jun answered them directly, and Jun Seok answered them directly. And somewhere in the third hour, she understood that she had become, without any formal announcement, a functional participant in a restructuring process that would determine what this organization became. She wasn't sure how she felt about that. She was sure that she understood the work, and that understanding it was better than not understanding it, and that a child growing inside her had a stake in the outcome of this table, and that she was going to represent that stake as precisely as she could. The security company, she said during a discussion about what the legitimate holding structure would become. Jun Seok mentioned it last night. Executive protection, corporate intelligence, cybersecurity. That's real. There's genuine market for it, and the existing personnel have transferable skills. She looked at Tae-jun. But it has to be actually clean, not a front with a clean surface. The compliance architecture has to be built by someone who isn't already part of the organization, someone with no prior relationship to any of this. You're describing a significant transparency risk, Jun Seok said. Not disagreeing, assessing. I'm describing the only version that works long-term, she said. Fronts get pulled apart eventually. Real businesses survive because they're actually real. She looked at both of them. Your brother understood that, she said to Tae-jun. He wasn't naive. He'd seen exactly what the alternative looked like from the inside for his entire life. He understood that the alternative was also the thing that killed people. Tae-jun was quiet. Yes, he said. He did. Then build what he saw, not a version of it, the actual thing. The room was quiet for a moment. Jun Seok looked at his folder. Then he looked up and said, I know a compliance attorney. Seoul-based, international practice. No prior connection to us. Excellent reputation. Tae-jun nodded. Call her. Bet. Malcolm Brooks was formally arrested 11 weeks after the federal package landed. Imani heard about it from Tae-jun, who heard about it from his attorney in New York, who heard about it from the news. It happened on a Tuesday morning outside a building in Washington, D.C., that Malcolm had apparently been using as a base of operations for his legitimate holdings. The ones that weren't legitimate, which was most of them. 4 federal agents. A brief exchange that didn't escalate to anything physical because Malcolm Brooks was, above all things, a man who understood when a position was indefensible and knew how to walk out of one without losing whatever he believed was his dignity. Tae-jun told her at the table, in the evening, without preamble. She held her tea and looked at the river for a long time. Are you all right? He said. I don't know yet, she said. Ask me again in a week. He nodded. He didn't press. She thought about how different that was from the way most people responded to someone not knowing their own feelings. The instinct to resolve the uncertainty for them, to offer an interpretation, to fill the silence with reassurance that was really about the other person's discomfort with the situation. Tae-jun left silences alone. It was one of the things about him she'd noticed early and continued to notice. She asked herself, sitting there, when she had started making lists of things she noticed about him. She didn't have a clear answer. That was its own kind of answer. He'll get a life sentence, she said. Probably. The evidence is substantial. I know. She turned the cup in her hands. I spent 18 years trying to get far enough away from him that what he did to people stopped being something I could feel. I got on a plane and I put an ocean between us, and I built something in a completely different language in a city that didn't know his name. She paused. And I still feel it. The arrest. I feel it. That's not weakness, Tae-jun said. I know it isn't. She looked at him. It's just, he's still my father. He was always going to be my father. I could put an ocean between us, and he was still going to be the person whose absence shaped what I became. That doesn't go away because he's in handcuffs. She breathed. I wanted it to feel like freedom. It just feels like an ending. Tae-jun was quiet. Then, sometimes endings are the only freedom available. She looked at him. Is that what Min-jae's death felt like to you? The question landed. She saw it land. His face moved through something and came back to stillness, and he said, for a long time it felt like nothing but pain. Then it felt like fuel. Then, he paused. Now it feels like a debt I'm trying to pay in a different currency than the one I started with. She nodded slowly. I think I understand that. They sat with the river and the city and the weight of the things they'd each been carrying for years, and the weight didn't lift. She'd long since stopped expecting weight to lift. But it redistributed, became something that could be carried differently by a different configuration of hands. The compliance attorney's name was Cha Soo-yeon, and she was 53 years old and had the specific brand of intelligence that announced itself not through performance but through the quality of the questions she asked. She came to the penthouse 3 times over 6 weeks, and by the 3rd meeting she had reviewed enough of the organizational structure to have strong opinions about it, which she expressed without softening them, and Tae-jun received them without the kind of ego that would have made the process impossible. Imani sat in on 2 of those meetings, not as a participant with a formal role. She'd been clear with herself about the limits of that, but as someone who understood the material and whose presence Tae-jun had simply continued to include without making it into a statement. After the 2nd meeting, Soo-yeon paused on her way out and looked at Imani with the direct assessment of a woman who made her living reading rooms. You understand compliance architecture, she said. Not a question. I understand how non-compliance gets hidden, Imani said, which is close to the same thing from the other direction. Soo-yeon looked at her for a moment. Where did you study? Literature, Yonsei. A brief pause. Interesting. She left. Imani didn't think about it further until 2 weeks later when Soo-yeon sent a short email, addressed to Imani directly, through Tae-jun's secure system, asking whether she would be willing to consult informally on the restructuring documentation, reviewing the narrative coherence of the transition story the company would present to regulators, whether the account of the organization's evolution held together under close reading. It was, Imani understood, a way of offering her something useful to do that was also genuinely useful. She wrote back yes. She called her thesis advisor in the 4th month. Professor Kim Yeon-hee answered on the 2nd ring and said without preamble, Imani, where have you been? Not an accusation, the statement of a woman who had been waiting with the particular controlled worry of someone who has learned to convert anxiety into patience because the alternative is unsustainable. I'm sorry, Imani said. Something happened. I'm safe. I'm in Seoul. I'm going to need to take a leave of absence. Silence. Then, how long? I don't know yet. Several months at minimum. Are you in trouble? I was. I'm less so now. Another silence. Is there anything I can do? Yes, Imani said. Save my enrollment status. I'm going to finish this dissertation. I just need time I didn't plan for. Professor Kim said, Your chapter draft is still on my desk. The 19 comments are still there. They'll keep. A pause. Call me when you're ready. I'll be here. Imani held the phone after the call ended and felt something she hadn't felt in months, the specific textured reality of a life she'd built herself, waiting for her, intact. The dissertation. The argument she was trying to make about spatial memory and diaspora, and what it meant to carry a geography inside you that no longer existed in the form you learned it. The work she'd chosen because it was hers in a way that nothing inherited ever could be. She was going to go back to it. She put the phone down and went to find Mi-suk because she was hungry, which was new. The appetite had been complicated for months, and its return felt like the body making a statement about its own future. What? The baby came in the 7th month of Imani's stay in the penthouse, which was also the 4th month of the organizational transition, which was also the month that 2 of Tae-jun's former operational territories were formally transferred to legitimate holding structures, and Soo-yeon filed the first round of regulatory documents with the kind of thoroughness that left no productive questions unanswered. The birth was not in a hospital. This had been a source of extended disagreement between Imani and Tae-jun that lasted 3 weeks and involved several conversations that were heated enough to qualify as genuine arguments rather than their usual brand of confrontational discussion. She wanted a hospital, understood why she wanted a hospital, and explained with careful specificity why a hospital created exposure she might not want, records, connections to her name, information that could surface at a wrong moment while Malcolm's trial was still in process, and the legal landscape around her situation was still technically undefined. She said the legal landscape around her situation being undefined was his fault. He said yes, it was, and he was sorry, and the hospital was still a risk she might not want. She said she didn't want her child born in a penthouse above the Han River like a transaction. He said he understood that, and he was going to do everything possible to make sure it wasn't like that. He arranged a private obstetric team, Dr. Brooks on his primary, 2 specialized nurses, equipment that converted the penthouse's secondary room into something that was not a hospital but was staffed and equipped with the seriousness of one. He had a direct line to a surgical team on standby at a private clinic 4 minutes away. He sat outside the room for 11 hours without leaving the floor, except once when Jun Seok appeared with something that required an actual signature, and Tae-jun signed it in the corridor in 30 seconds and was back before the door closed. Imani knew he was out there. Mi-suk told her, because Mi-suk had opinions about what information was useful to have while working through labor, and this was apparently on the list. She thought about David. She thought about him carefully and honestly over the preceding months, and had grieved the simplicity of what they might have been in a different configuration of events. She'd sent a message, carefully worded, through a channel Tae-jun's system, made secure, telling him she was safe, telling him there was a child, telling him that she was not going to ask anything of him, and that whatever he chose to do with the information was his right, and that she was sorry for the circumstances. He'd written back within a day. The message was kind and honest and appropriately stunned, and ultimately said that he would like to be told when the child was born, and that he would need time to understand what his role could be, if any, and that he wished her well with a sincerity she believed. She'd written back, "I'll tell you, take the time you need." And then she'd put it in the part of her mind reserved for things that were real and ongoing, but not immediately resolvable, and she'd gotten on with the work of the months between. The baby arrived at 4:17 in the morning. She was healthy and loud about it. Announced herself to the room with the specific authority of a person who had been waiting and was done waiting and required acknowledgement of her arrival. Doctor, and said something in Korean that the nurse translated as a weight and length, and both were good. Imani held her and felt the particular shock of it. The specific, unrepeatable shock of a person you have been carrying for months becoming suddenly external to you, becoming a weight in your arms rather than a weight inside you, becoming something you can look at. She looked at her for a long time. "Hello," she said quietly, to a daughter who wouldn't remember this moment, but who was already, Imani understood, the organizing fact of everything that came after it. Tae-jun came in when they told him he could. He stood in the doorway for a moment. Imani was sitting up in the bed they'd brought in, the baby against her chest, the room full of the specific quiet that follows something enormous. He looked at the two of them, and his face did something she'd never seen it do. Not the composure giving way to grief, which she'd seen twice, and not the almost smiles she'd catalogued, and not the reading expression. Something that had no calculation in it at all. Something that was simply response, unmediated, a human face reacting to a human moment without any of the management systems engaged. He crossed the room and sat in the chair beside the bed and looked at the baby. "She's very small," he said. "She's exactly the right size." Imani shifted slightly. "Do you want to hold her?" He looked at her. "I don't. She won't break." She held the child out. "You've been in a chair outside for 11 hours. You've earned it." He took the baby with both hands, carefully, with the specific care of someone who understood that they were holding something that mattered more than anything they'd held before, and who was determined not to get this wrong. He settled her against his chest. The baby made a small investigating sound, and then went quiet. Tae-jun sat very still. His face was doing that unmediated thing again, the thing with nothing managed about it, and Imani watched him understand something she couldn't put words to from the outside. Watched it happen in real time, in his eyes, in the slight change in the set of his shoulders. "Nari," Imani said. He looked up. I want to name her Nari. She'd been turning it over for weeks. It meant Lily in Korean. It was also a name her daughter could carry between two languages, two heritages, the complicated geography of what she'd come from. If that's... I wanted to ask you. Tae-jun looked at the baby. Something moved in his throat. Nari, he said, saying it in the register of the language it belonged to, which was different from how she'd said it. Better. Yes, she said. That. He sat with Nari for a long time, and she let him. The conversation about what they were to each other happened 3 weeks after the birth, not dramatically, not in the middle of a significant moment. It happened in the kitchen at 10 in the morning while Imani was eating and Tae-jun was standing at the counter with coffee, and Nari was in the other room with Mi-suk making the small investigating sounds she'd been making since day one. Imani said, I'm going back to my dissertation. Tae-jun said, I know. Professor Kim is holding my enrollment. I can take the rest of this academic year and be back in the program for the next one. That's good. I can't do it from the penthouse. He was quiet. I need an apartment, she said. My own. Not here. Not somewhere you've arranged. Something I find, something I pay for, with my stipend if my funding holds and with savings if it doesn't. I need a space that's mine. He turned his coffee cup slowly. I understand. I'm not leaving Seoul. I'm not taking Nari somewhere you can't see her. She looked at him directly. That's not what I want. But I need to be somewhere I chose, or none of it means what I need it to mean. He looked at her. What do you want this to be, he said, between us? Tell me plainly. She'd been preparing for this question for weeks, and still found it harder than she'd expected. I want it to be real, she said, whatever it is. Not a situation I'm inside because I have no exit. Not a thing that exists because we've been through something enormous together, and proximity got confused with feeling. She paused. I want to live separately and see you because I've decided to, and have you be different from everything I came from, and find out what's actually here between two people who aren't in a hostage situation. The last two words landed with the weight of the thing they were, honest and unsparing, and also, underneath them, something warmer than the language suggested. Tae-jun was quiet for a long moment. That's what I want as well, he said. Exactly that. Then we start there, yes. She found an apartment 2 weeks later in Mapogu. 4th floor, 2 bedrooms, a window in the main room that faced east and got the morning light in a way she stood in for the first time and understood immediately was going to be important to her. It was smaller than she'd had before, modest by any measure, which was exactly what she wanted. She signed the lease herself, with her own name, and carried the keys home in her pocket and felt them there all afternoon. She told Mi-suk she was leaving, and Mi-suk hugged her briefly and efficiently and then said, the baby needs ginger in her bathwater for the first year, for her skin. Imani said she'd remember. She thought she'd also carry with her, for the rest of her life, the image of Mi-suk at the stove with her back turned, offering the small mercy of pretending not to see things that needed not to be seen. She moved out on a Thursday. Tae-jun helped carry boxes, which was not something she'd asked for, and which he offered without making it into something beyond what it was, a practical contribution to a logistical task, 2 people maneuvering a portable crib through a doorway and disagreeing briefly about the angle and getting it through anyway. The organizational transition took 14 months to complete. Not every piece of it went cleanly. There were former associates who did not accept the change with grace and required management of a kind that Imani didn't ask the details of, and Tae-jun didn't volunteer. There were financial structures that had to be unwound slowly to avoid triggering the kind of regulatory attention that would have complicated the very transition they were attempting. There were conversations with organizations that had expected Tae-jun's operation to continue in its existing form and who had to be persuaded through various means that the new configuration was more durable and therefore more reliable than what they'd had before. Jun Seok navigated most of this. Tae-jun had told her early that Jun Seok was the most operationally intelligent person he'd ever worked with, and that his loyalty, now that it had been tested in the most severe way available, was also the most durable thing in the organization. She watched Jun Seok work over 14 months and understood both statements to be accurate. He managed the transition the way he managed everything, with the quiet, comprehensive competence of someone who had spent 20 years learning an extremely complicated system from the inside and now understood every lever. His daughter came to the new company's first official board meeting. She was 22, studying finance. She sat at the back of the room and said nothing and watched everything. And on her way out, she shook Imani's hand with the specific gravity of someone who understood there was a debt in the gesture that couldn't be fully articulated. Imani said, "You don't owe me anything." The young woman said, "I know. That's why I wanted to say thank you." Malcolm's trial lasted 7 weeks. Imani followed it through news reports and through the attorney in New York, who had agreed to keep her informed. She did not attend. She sat in her apartment in Mapogu with Nari and her dissertation drafts and the morning light coming through the east window, and she read the updates when they arrived and felt each one in a specific and private way that she didn't share with anyone except, twice, with her therapist. She had started seeing a therapist in the 3rd month after leaving the penthouse. A woman in her early 60s, Korean, who had studied in the United States and worked primarily with people navigating trauma that was complicated by ambivalence. Imani had chosen her precisely for the specialization. Her trauma was not clean. It did not have a simple villain and a clear aftermath. It had a man who had kidnapped her and then protected her child, and then spent 14 months dismantling the empire he'd built in order to become the person her condition required. And her feelings about all of it were layered and honest and did not resolve into anything simple. And she needed a space where that was the acceptable version of recovery. The therapist, whose name was Dr. O, had said in the first session, "You don't need to organize this into a story with a lesson. You can just have experienced it." Imani had cried for the first time in months at that sentence, not dramatically, just steadily, for a few minutes, while Dr. O waited. "I'm a literature scholar," she'd said when it passed. "I organize everything into a story with a lesson. It's what I do." "Then you know," Dr. O had said, "that the best literature doesn't organize itself that way. It just shows people surviving things. The reader finds what they need in it." Tae-jun proposed on a Saturday evening in the small garden of the house they'd been looking at in the Eunpyeong district, a modern place, single family, with a garden that needed work and neighbors visible from the front walk and trees that had been there longer than either of them. He did not get down on one knee. He was not that kind of man, and she would not have wanted him to be. He stood in the garden with the late light coming through the trees and Nari on his hip, because she'd reached the age of demanding to be carried everywhere and refusing all alternatives, and he said, "I want to live here with you, if you want that." Imani looked at him, at the house, at the garden, at her daughter on the hip of the man who had opened an elevator door for her 7 months after taking her off a sidewalk in the rain, and stepped back and waited. "That's the proposal," she said. "That's the proposal. No ring. I can get a ring. I didn't know if—" "I don't want a ring," she said. "I want the garden." He looked at her. "Yes?" She looked at the trees, the neighbor, the ordinary, unremarkable fact of a life that existed on its own terms, that nobody was using as leverage, that had no strategic value to anyone, that was simply a life. "Yes," she said. They married on a Friday in a civil office with 8 people in the room. Jun Seok and his daughter, Dr. Han, Mi Suk, Soo Yeon, Professor Kim, who had come because Imani had asked, and who had arrived with the matter-of-fact acceptance of a woman who had decided she did not need all the context to show up for someone she believed in, and 2 people from Tae-jun's new company who had been there from the beginning and deserved to be there at this. Nari wore a yellow dress and spent the ceremony attempting to eat the edge of Imani's jacket. The official asked them to confirm their consent, and they both said yes with the specific weight of people who understood exactly what they were consenting to and had thought about it for a long time. Nari took her first steps in the garden on a Tuesday afternoon in October, 11 months after they moved into the house in Eunpyeong. She was unsteady and determined and fell twice and got up both times with an expression of pure focused fury that Imani recognized immediately as something she'd seen on another face in a different room a long time ago, and which made her laugh in a way that started deep and came out fully, the kind of laugh that happens when something true surfaces unexpectedly. Tae-jun was watching from the garden bench. He caught Imani's eye. "She gets that from you," he said. "She absolutely does not. The fury when something doesn't work immediately, that's a universal human response to difficulty. The way she gets back up, Tae-jun, and looks at the thing that stopped her like she's making a decision about it. I'm not having this conversation. He almost smiled. It reached all the way now. It had been reaching all the way for months. She'd stopped cataloging when it happened because it had become the ordinary register of his face rather than a departure from it. Nari took 3 more steps, wavered, and sat down in the grass with the decisive thump of a person who has concluded that this is a reasonable place to be and is not going to perform distress about it. She looked at the grass, picked up a small stone, examined it with total concentration. Tae-jun said quietly, "Min-jae would have loved her." Imani looked at him. "Tell me about him," she said. "Something I don't know." He thought for a moment. He used to leave books in public places, not give them away. Leave them. On benches, in restaurants, on the subway. He had this theory that a book finding the right reader was more interesting than giving it directly. He said the journey was part of what the book meant. Imani looked at the bookshelves in the penthouse, at the books that had been left precisely, specifically, by author, the selection that had frightened her because of how well it knew her. "The library," she said. "Yes," Tae-jun said. She understood now why it had been stocked that way. Not as strategy, not as intelligence applied to manipulation. Something older and simpler, a habit of a man shaped by a brother who believed books should find their readers. And a reader had arrived in his house, and the habit had operated without him fully accounting for it. She looked at the garden, at Nari in the grass with her stone, at the trees that had been there longer than any of them. "I want to tell her about him," she said. "When she's old enough, I want her to know she has an uncle she never got to meet who believed in things worth believing in." Tae-jun didn't say anything for a moment. When he did, his voice had the quality it always had when it got to something real, stripped down, no performance. "I'd like that." "Then we'll tell her." Well, the company held its 2-year review in the spring. Soo Yeon presented the compliance audit results with the satisfaction of someone whose thoroughness had been rewarded with a clean report, and Jun Seok walked through the operational numbers with the efficiency of a man who had spent 2 years building something he was proud of and was not going to be overly demonstrative about it. The security and risk management work had found its market precisely where they'd predicted: corporations operating in complex regional environments, executives requiring protection that understood both legal and extra-legal threat landscapes, cybersecurity work that drew on exactly the kind of institutional knowledge that no credential could produce. It was, Soo-yeon said, a genuinely viable company, not a front, not a surface, a company. After the review, Tae-jun stood at the window of the conference room for a long time. Imani watched him from across the room. She'd been consulting formally now for 18 months. The narrative coherence work had expanded into something closer to a strategic communications role, helping the company articulate its evolution to regulatory bodies and potential clients in a way that was accurate rather than managed. It was not the work she'd chosen, but it used what she knew, and it mattered in the way that work matters when you understand why you're doing it. She crossed to where he was standing. "Min-jae's dream," she said. "More or less," he said. He'd have had opinions about the cybersecurity division. Good opinions or critical ones? Both, probably. He usually did. She stood beside him and looked out at the city, not the Han River from above. They were in a different building now, lower, closer to street level, closer to the ordinary, unremarkable life of a city that didn't know or particularly care what transformation had occurred in the floors above it. "I'm submitting the dissertation next month," she said. He turned to look at her. "Final draft." Professor Kim's read it twice. Soo-yeon read the compliance adjacent section because it turns out she has opinions about the relationship between regulatory narrative and post-colonial literature, which I did not anticipate but found useful. She paused. "It's done. It's actually done." He looked at her with something in his face that was not pride exactly. Pride was too simple for it, too unidirectional, more like the recognition of a person who has watched someone carry something heavy for a long time and has now seen them set it down in the right place. "What will you do after?" he said. "Teach," she said. "I want to teach." She looked at the city. "Here, I think. Seoul. Yonsei, if they'll have me. Somewhere else if they won't. I want to stay." "You're sure?" She looked at him. "I chose this city when I was 22 because it felt like somewhere I could become who I was trying to be. I still feel that." She paused. "The circumstances of the last 2 years were not what I'd have chosen, But the city is still the city. The work is still the work. She held his gaze. And I have reasons to stay that I didn't have before. He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked back at the city. I'm going to hold a memorial for Min Jae, he said. This year. Something simple. I haven't done it. I kept thinking it wasn't time. I think it's time. Yes, she said. It is. I'd like you there. We'll all be there, she said. You, me, Nari, Junseok. The people who knew him. She put her hand over his on the windowsill. The people who are building what he believed in. He looked at their hands for a moment, turned his over so that hers was properly held. Outside, Seoul moved through its afternoon with the comprehensive indifference of a city that contains millions of private transformations at any given moment and registers none of them specifically. Every window a different story, every street-level decision, a different person trying to navigate the distance between who they've been and who they're capable of becoming. In a house in Eunpyeong, a little girl named Nari Seo slept in a room with morning-facing windows and a garden outside where her footprints from Tuesday's walking practice were still pressed into the soft earth, small and clear and deliberate, going forward. Her mother had come to Seoul at 22 to build something that belonged to her. She was still building it. Her father had spent 35 years constructing a fortress around a grief that was real and a rage that was justified, and a loneliness that he hadn't named until a woman threw his whiskey in his face and asked him who he thought he was becoming. He knew now. The answer was still in progress, which was the only honest answer available. It was enough. It was, it turned out, exactly